Your bread molds in 4 days. In 1952, a farm wife baked a loaf on a Monday, and it was still good 2 Mondays later. Same flour, same water, same yeast in the air. No refrigerator, no preservatives, no plastic, no twist tie, no printed date on the wrapper telling her when to throw it away. A crock on the counter and a piece of linen and bread that outlasted anything you can buy today by a factor of 3. Go look at the loaf on your counter right now. Squeeze it. It gives, does it not? It comes right back like a sponge. That softness is the thing you have been trained to want, the thing the picture on the bag is selling you, and it is the exact reason that loaf will be green on Friday. You are not buying bread. You are buying water at bread prices, and every ounce of that water is an invitation. I am going to tell you what she did instead. It is not a recipe, and it is not a gadget, and it does not cost you anything. It is three things, and the second one is going to sound completely backward until you understand it, because the second one is the one nobody says out loud. I grew up in a house where bread was baked on Saturday, 6 loaves at a time, in an oven my grandmother heated with wood until she stopped trusting it, and my grandfather put in a range. Those 6 loaves fed 9 people for a week and a day. Not one of them ever went moldy. Not one. I did not see mold on a piece of bread until I was a grown man buying it in a store, and the first time I did, I honestly thought something was wrong with that particular bag. There was nothing wrong with the bag. The bag was working exactly the way it was designed to work. By the end of this, you will know the one thing mold needs that nothing else on your counter can give it. You will know why the softest bread is always the first to spoil, and why that is not an accident. You will know the one place in your kitchen you must never put a loaf, and I promise you that is where you are putting it right now. And you will know why my grandmother would have laughed at the idea of keeping bread fresh, because keeping it fresh was never the goal. Stay with me, because the second part turns this whole thing upside down. Here is what you have to understand first. Mold does not eat bread. Mold drinks it. Every loaf on earth, yours and hers, is covered in mold spores within about a minute of coming out of the oven. That is not a failure of cleanliness. Spores are in the air of every kitchen in the world, in every bakery, and every hospital. You cannot keep them off. She could not either. There was no sterile farmhouse. There were flour sacks and barn cats and an open window over the sink. So the question was never how to keep the spores off the bread. The question was whether the spores could find anything to drink when they landed. A spore is essentially asleep. It needs free water to wake up and grow, and the word that matters here is free. Not the water baked into the starch, not the water bound up in the crumb. Loose available surface moisture. Give a spore that at room temperature, and you have visible mold in 3 to 5 days. Withhold it, and that same spore will sit there dry and dormant for weeks and never do a thing. That is the entire war. Everything else is detail, and now look at what has been done to your loaf. Modern commercial bread is built wetter than any farmhouse loaf ever was. More water in the dough, softening agents, enzymes that hold moisture in the crumb, sugars that pull water out of the air. It is baked pale and fast so the crust stays soft. Then it is sliced, which multiplies the exposed surface, and bagged while still carrying warmth, so every bit of moisture that tries to leave hits that plastic, condenses, and runs back onto the bread. They then have to add a mold inhibitor to fight the conditions they just built, and it still goes green in 5 days. Think about that. It has a preservative in it, and it still loses to a loaf that had nothing. I ran this side by side in my own kitchen 2 summers ago because I wanted to see it rather than repeat it. Same counter, same shelf, same air, same week. One loaf was a soft sandwich bread from the store left in the bag it came in. The other was an unsliced sourdough from a bakery counter, cooled all the way, wrapped in a cotton towel and set in a covered crock. The bagged loaf had its first gray spot on day 4. By day 6, it was not a question anymore, and it went in the bin. The loaf in the crock was firm on day 6 and perfectly good under butter. On day 9, it was hard enough that I stopped slicing it thin, and it made the best toast I had eaten in a while. On day 12, it was dry all the way through, and there was not a spot of mold anywhere on it. I ran it under the tap and put it in a hot oven, and we ate it that night. Same kitchen, same spores landing on both. 12 days against 4, and the only things that were different were how wet the bread was and how sour. Now, the first part of what she did, the sour. Her bread was acidic, and mold hates acid. Some weeks she baked with a starter kept in a crock at the back of the counter. Some weeks she was quicker about it and simply tore a fist of dough off Saturday's batch, covered it, and dropped it into the next batch a week later. Either way, the same thing happened. Lactic acid bacteria worked in that dough alongside the yeast and they left acid behind. That acid lowers the pH of the crumb, and a lower pH slows mold growth substantially. This is not folk belief. It is the reason a true sourdough loaf keeps visibly longer than a fast commercial one, and it is measurable in any bakery in the country. That fist of old dough is worth sitting on for a second because it is the oldest trick in baking, and almost nobody does it now. It costs nothing. It is a piece of dough you already made, kept back, and put to work again. A bakery would call it a preferment today and charge you for the loaf accordingly. She called it the piece from last week, and it carried a whole colony of yeast and acid bacteria forward from one Saturday to the next. So every loaf she made was seeded by the one before it. Bread that descended from bread. She did not know the word lactobacillus. She knew that the bread made with the old dough kept, and the bread made in a hurry did not. She had the mechanism right without ever needing the name for it. And here is the part people get wrong when they try this. The bread does not taste sour. A small amount of acid sits well under the level where your tongue registers sour. It reads as flavor, as depth, as bread that tastes like something instead of tasting like sweet air. If this is already making you look at that bag on your counter differently, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on while you're there. I put out one of these every week, the old practical knowledge that worked for 100 years and got quietly replaced with something you have to buy. The bell is the only way these actually reach you. Then stay right here because the next part is the one that changes everything. Here is the second part, and it is going to sound wrong. She was not keeping the bread fresh, she was keeping it dry. Read that again because it is the whole thing. A farm wife did not fight staling, she scheduled it. She wanted that loaf to give up its moisture, slowly and evenly, day after day, because a drying loaf is a loaf that mold cannot touch. Monday's bread was soft, Wednesday's bread was firm, Friday's bread wanted butter, Sunday's bread wanted toasting, and at no point in that week was it spoiled, because it was never wet enough to spoil. Now, here is the distinction that nobody in the modern grocery business wants you to hold in your head because the entire product depends on you confusing the two. Stale and spoiled are not the same thing. They are not even related. Stalling is a physical change. The starch in the crumb reorganizes itself over time and pushes water out and the bread firms up. Nothing has gone bad, nothing is growing, nothing will hurt you. And best of all, it is reversible. Heat undoes it. That is why a stale loaf put in a hot oven for a few minutes comes back out soft, and why toast exists in the first place. Spoiling is biological. Something is alive and growing in that loaf. That is not reversible by anything. Every kitchen in America used to know this difference by instinct. A loaf that had firmed up was not a loaf anybody worried about. It was Tuesday's bread, and Tuesday's bread had a job. Somewhere along the way, we lost the second category entirely, and now a loaf is either soft or it is garbage. Your great-grandmother's bread went stale. Your bread goes moldy. She was trading a problem that heat fixes for a problem that nothing fixes, and she was making that trade on purpose every single week of her life. So when you squeeze a loaf in the store to see how soft it is, understand what you are actually testing for. You are testing for how much water they left in it. You are picking the loaf that will fail fastest and calling it the freshest one. Now, let me tell you who profits from this. Water is the cheapest thing in a bakery, and bread is sold by weight and by the loaf. Every point of moisture they can hold in that crumb is flour they did not have to buy. You are paying bread money for tap water, and the softness that costs them almost nothing is the exact quality the packaging is designed to advertise. Then the softness creates a second problem, and the second problem creates a second sale. Wet bread spoils fast, so it needs a mold inhibitor. It needs a sealed plastic bag. It needs a printed date that tells you to throw out a loaf that in many cases is still perfectly good, and a fresh one goes onto the shelf in its place. A product that fails on a schedule is not a defect in that business. It is the business. I am not telling you there is a room somewhere where men sit down and decide this. I do not believe in that. What I believe, why it is simpler and worse. It is a quiet agreement among everybody who profits to never mention that dry bread lasts because nobody has ever made $1 selling you a crock and a piece of cloth. They do not have to coordinate, they only have to stay quiet, and they have stayed quiet for 70 years. If that landed, hit like and subscribe and turn on the bell. Now here is the third part, and it is the one you can do tonight. The third part is where you put it. She kept bread in a stoneware crock with a loose lid, or in a wooden box in a cool corner, wrapped in a piece of plain linen or a flour sack towel. That is it. and every part of that is doing a job. The cloth breathes. It lets moisture leave the loaf slowly instead of trapping it against the crust. Plastic does the opposite. Plastic holds every bit of water in and puts it right back where the spores are waiting. That is why bread in a bag goes soft and then goes green, and bread in cloth goes firm and stays clean. The crock is not airtight and was never meant to be. It slows the drying to a walk instead of a sprint. A bread box is not a container, it is a compromise, and the compromise is the whole point, and the loaf goes in whole. She cut what the table needed and stood the loaf back down on its cut face, so the bread's own crust sealed the only opening. A whole loaf exposes nothing but crust, and crust is dry, dense, and hostile. Pre-sliced bread is not a convenience that happens to spoil. It is a loaf with every one of its defenses removed before you get it home. Now the warnings, because this is where the internet does real harm, and I will not do the same. First, and I want to be plain about this, if you see mold on a loaf, throw the whole loaf out. Do not cut around it. Do not pick off the fuzzy corner and eat the rest. Bread is soft and full of air, which means what you can see on the surface is a small part of what is already spread through the crumb where you cannot see it. And some of the molds that grow on bread produce toxins that heat does not destroy. Toasting it does not save it. Hard cheese is a different situation with different structure. Bread is not. The whole loaf goes. Second, and this is the one that will surprise most of you, do not put bread in the refrigerator. The refrigerator is the single worst place in your kitchen for a loaf of bread. The temperature range in there is almost exactly the range where starch firms up fastest, so bread stales several times quicker in the fridge than it does on the counter, and it barely slows the mold at all. You get the worst of both. If you're not going to eat it inside the window, freeze it. Freezing is genuinely fine. It stops the clock on both problems. The fridge stops neither and speeds one up. Third, never put away a warm loaf. Let it cool all the way through, 2 hours at least, on a rack with air underneath it. A warm loaf is still releasing steam, and if you wrap it, that steam has nowhere to go but back into the crust. That single mistake will mold a good loaf faster than anything else on this list. Fourth, wipe out your bread box. Every couple of weeks, a cloth with a little vinegar on it, then let it dry completely before the bread goes back in. Crumbs and old moisture in the bottom of that box are a spore nursery, and you have been reinfecting every fresh loaf you put in there. Now here is exactly what to do, start to finish. Buy or bake a real loaf, unsliced, with a proper dark crust. The bakery counter, not the bread aisle, and ask them not to slice it. Sourdough is better still. That is your acid working for you. Let it cool completely. 2 hours minimum, on a rack, uncovered. Wrap it in linen or plain cotton. A flour sack towel is ideal. No plastic, no foil, no zip bag. Put it in a crock or a wooden box in the coolest corner of the kitchen that is not the fridge. Loose lid, not sealed. Cut only what you need and stand the loaf back down on its cut face every time. Around day 4 or 5, when it firms up, stop treating it as fresh bread and start treating it as good bread that wants heat. Toast it, griddle it in butter. Past that, run the whole loaf briefly under the tap, shake it off, and put it in a hot oven for 5 or 6 minutes. The water turns to steam inside the crumb, the starch relaxes, and it comes out crisp outside and soft inside. It works once. Eat it that day. Whatever you are not going to reach in that window, slice it and freeze it on the first day while it is at its best. Now, 2 questions I get every time I bring this up. The first is from people whose bread goes hard in 2 days and who assume that is the same failure. It is not, and this is the good news. Hard is not spoiled. Hard means the loaf is drying faster than you are eating it, which is a scheduling problem, not a safety one. Slow it down with a cloth and a closed box, or bake and freeze in halves. Heat brings it back either way. The second is that somebody will tell you the refrigerator is the safe choice and that leaving bread on a counter is asking for trouble. Ask them what they think mold needs. It needs moisture, and the fridge does not remove any. All the fridge does is drive the starch to firm up faster, while the spores carry on at their own pace. The freezer is the safe choice, the counter is the good choice, the fridge is the one that gets you neither. If you have gotten this far with me, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Nobody sponsors a video about a piece of cloth and a clay pot, so the only thing keeping this in front of people is you. One more thing, because it is the part I actually think about. In that house, a loaf was never thrown away. Fresh bread went on the table, firm bread went under the broiler. Hard bread was grated into crumbs for a casserole, like what went past that became pudding on Sunday. and whatever was left went out to the chickens who turned it into eggs. Nothing was fresh forever, nothing had to be. Every loaf moved down the ladder until it was gone. I asked her once why she never bought the soft bread from town when it showed up at the store. She thought about it a while and said she did not care to buy a thing that was already halfway to being garbage. She was not being thrifty and she was not being stubborn. She refused to bring something into her house that was built to fail on a date somebody else had chosen. You did not forget this. Nobody taught you, and then you forgot. It was taken from you one soft white loaf at a time until you stood in an aisle full of bread that cannot survive a week and never thought to ask why it used to. So do one thing this week, one unsliced loaf, a cotton towel out of the plastic and out of the fridge, and look at it on day 8. Then tell me in the comments what happened, what county you were in, and what your grandmother kept her bread in. I read every one of these, and those stories are the reason I keep recording. And if this rang true to you, come back for the next one, because I am going to show you how she kept butter sweet and spreadable on the counter all summer with no ice and no refrigerator, using a crock, cold water, and one thing about the lid that almost nobody gets right. Nobody sells it, so nobody teaches it. I will. Keep it simple. Keep it yours. And remember, the people who fed this country out of a wooden box knew things we are only just starting to remember.